And welcome to day one of the American Foreign Policy Heartland Trip. My name is Deja Gainey, and I am a first-year MA candidate concentrating in American Foreign Policy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. I'm joined today by my co-host, John Bolton, a PhD candidate studying U.S.-China relations, active duty Army officer, and native Nebraskan. Established in 1943 during World War II, SICE seeks to prepare men and women to serve as leaders within the public and private sectors to enable Americans to cope with the international responsibilities. SICE's curriculum was designed to be both scholarly and practical. The purpose of today's Heartland Trip is to provide information, perspective, and understanding about the influence and effects of American foreign policy on the American heartland. The end result of this event will be an informal report relating to Heartland concerns to SICE students and the broader policy community. Our virtual trip is split into 2 days. Today, you will have the opportunity to hear from business leaders representing the following organizations: the Nebraska Chamber of Commerce, the Cattlemen's Association, the Nebraska Farm Bureau, and the Nebraska Corn Board. Tomorrow's event will be focused on business and government institutions in Nebraska. Before we begin, please note that today's event is on the record. The format of the event is a revolving panel where guests are given approximately 1 hour each. John and I have asked each participant to provide 5 to 10 minutes of comments on issues they feel best relate to foreign policy to the heartland affairs, ranging from trade to visas and beyond. Afterward, the remainder of the time is open for Q&A. Please submit your questions using the Q&A chat function as soon as you can, and the moderator will read them to the participant. When asking a question, please indicate your name and SICE affiliation. Our first speaker today is Mr. Pete Mclemont from the Nebraska Cattlemen. He is the Executive Vice President of the Nebraska Cattlemen. Pete is a native of Whole Ridge, Nebraska, and a graduate of the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. He worked on a fourth-generation family farm, diversified farming operation, including feedlot, stocker, cow and calf, and farming largely comprised of corn, soybean, and alfalfa production. Prior to his selection as the Executive Vice President of Nebraska Cattlemen in 2013, Pete served as the Vice President of Legislative Affairs with responsibilities primarily focused on lobbying at the state level. Thank you so much, Mr. Mclemont, for joining us.
Thank you, Deja, and thank you, John, and all those related and connected with Johns Hopkins. This is an honor to be a part of this. And so to give some context of Nebraska that will help me and the rest of the presenters today, I want to give some basic facts about our state. Obviously, we are a very rural state. We have 1.95 million people in the state, and over half of those, about 55%, reside in essentially contiguous counties between Lincoln and Omaha. So that gives a really good idea that we are a very rural state. So some basic facts that will help you understand Nebraska, why it's a great place for agriculture and specifically beef. So over half of our acres in our state are basically grasslands, which lends itself to Nebraska being the fourth largest cow-calf state in the country. We also have about 5 million cattle that come to Nebraska feedlots that are finished there before they go off to harvest. And connection to our corn industry is very strong, as you'll hear from my colleague and friend Kelly Brunkhorst later in the presentation. So out of that becomes our ethanol industry, which is second or third in the country. And so from that production, there are distillers' grains that go back into the diets of cattle. So that's a very important part of it. We are very fortunate in the state of Nebraska to basically be over the Ogallala Aquifer. It's one of the largest underground aquifers in the world and the largest in the country. And Nebraska has done an excellent job in managing that water resource. And there are many parts of the aquifer in Nebraska that are actually rising because of great management by our farmers and ranchers. So that's a fact we're very proud of. We're a leader in the country in that. So as I stated, some basic facts about the beef industry in Nebraska. We are the fourth largest in terms of cow-calf. We are either, depending on the year, first, second, or third in the number of cattle that go to harvest. And we're very fortunate because you want competition, which then raises the prices for the producers. So we have 7 major packing plants within the state. So our colleagues in states in Iowa, Kansas, Colorado, and Texas are very jealous of that. So that creates great value for our producers. And that to the basic context of this webinar series is that we are the leader in the country on beef exports around the world. So roughly $325 per head is derived from exports, and that goes worldwide. Our biggest partners are Japan, South Korea, and our neighbors to the north and south, Canada, Mexico. And some of that is accentuated by the fact Mexico, their consumers like products that we don't. So there's a soup called menudo, and menudo is basically beef intestine. So there's not too many people in the U.S. that like that, and it's part of their active diet. But yet our consumers to the south of Mexico enjoy that. So that's an important fact. And obviously our exports, we're always looking to expand that. Some important parts about the Nebraska Cattlemen membership. The Department of Ag in Nebraska guesstimates there are about 45,000 people in the state that own a beef cow. And so our membership is a voluntary membership, and just under 4,000 people are members. And so it's a volunteer basis to which you join, and you pay on a per head basis. So as Daisha alluded to in my biography, we cover everything that affects beef producers in their operations. And obviously it would project onto cattle and beef production, being part of the state and how we interact with government. But also too, I'm proud of our membership. We did a really good job, and one of the presenters later is my friend and colleague, Kristen Hasbrook. She was very instrumental in how our association dove into looking at immigration, and then how it's extended on to the state and then nationally. And that's important, relevant, because the biggest issue for our members in the beef industry in Nebraska is labor. We are like every other state in the country. Our cities are growing and our rural populations are declining. So immigration and workforce is very important to us. And I just want to share that it's important to consider we just don't have a bunch of minimum wage jobs. So it is not unusual, and it's fact very commonplace, that workers can earn anywhere from $50,000 and up, depending on the responsibilities in any type of operation. So these are good paying jobs. Another part of what we're trying to do from a policy perspective that helps everything that we do is rural broadband. And so we're lacking in that, and we are really focused on trying to make that better, because everything is nowadays goes back to internet connectivity and broadband. And so our members are very progressive and they utilize technology. So it's just not for communication in their personal lives, but for their businesses and growing their businesses to utilize technology to try to improve that. And so it's much like it was 90 years ago when our country was expanding electricity delivery to people all across the country and in their particular state, and rural broadband is similar. And so it's a real focus on trying to improve that. In relation to trade, just a tidbit to kind of get people thinking about how beef can be a part of that. So as we look at what's happening in the UK with Brexit, and so we in the beef industry are very focused on trying to get on the ground floor, if in fact that does happen, and how we can provide opportunities for our producers to get to the basic 65 million population that is in the UK. And obviously the people in the UK would be hopeful that they could gain access to our 325 million population in our country. So then it gets into politics on what type of production and what kind of needs and desires consumers, for example, in the UK would want, that we can deliver upon that. So those things are all active, and what we try to do, provide value for our members. And as all the presenters after me, it's a small state. We operate in the same space, and so those things we cross over and work together on. So we're fortunate in that regard. So as we look at what are the possibilities for beef and worldwide, as an example, as I alluded to with Mexico and some products we export there, take a product like beef livers. That is obviously not something that people probably enjoy in the States as they would around the world. And so a partner there that's been really helpful in growing demand for beef is Egypt. So beef livers in this country are usually about $1 a pound. So it's been as high as $11 a pound in Egypt, and right now it's about $6 a pound. So the whole products that come out of a harvested beef animal are marketed actively anywhere in the world by the beef packers. And so we touch a lot, and it's important that we have it. So if you look at the recent bilateral trade agreement with Japan, that is huge for the beef industry in reducing our tariffs down, because in some products right now, they're as high as 39%. And over the life of the new agreement with Japan, it'll be similar to what Australia has. So we can get down to some really low tariffs that will help beef demand in Japan. And that comes back to producers, and hopefully stronger bids from the packers when producers are selling their market-ready cattle to the packers to be harvested. So those are just some of the facts to help give a backdrop of what Nebraska is as a state geographically and from our economy, and most specifically from a beef perspective. So Dacia, that would be my comments to tee off what we do as Nebraska Cattlemen for our producers in our industry.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. So far, I see one question. You mentioned that Japan and Korea are important importers for the beef industry. And one participant has a question regarding if China is an important importer of US beef as well. And if so, how have current trade policies affected your members' businesses?
So we, from a beef perspective, haven't felt the pain like our row crop counterparts. I'm sure Jay Rempe and Kelly Brunkhorst will touch upon that from a Farm Bureau and a Corn Growers Association perspective. So some of those retaliatory measures that were going on during the negotiations were directly targeted at row crop producers, corn, soybeans, and so forth, and that was disappointing, and it did have effect on beef production. But as the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, as Ambassador Lighthizer and Greg Dowd, who is the Ag Ambassador for USTR, they've been front and center in trying to provide better opportunities. So the way the negotiations have gone, it is not up to future administrations to change. These agreements, especially with China, have been structured so they are a foundation and they essentially can't be changed. So I think once we see them fully implemented and getting access back to China after we were essentially excluded from their market after December 23rd of 2003 when BSE was found in Washington State, and it's taken us basically 15 years to get back there. So we haven't felt the pain that the corn and soybean people have. And so we're hopeful, because if they're eating 1 ounce per their population, and if they double it, that is significant to what it would mean to our exports to China.
Great. And then another question regarding the export markets in Nebraska. You mentioned also that Mexico and Canada were the 2 largest export markets, and I was wondering how has the USMCA agreement affected the beef industry in Nebraska so far?
Excellent question. So we actively, as Nebraska Cattlemen and our national association, have strong relations with our counterparts in Canada and Mexico. And so essentially all 3 countries are saying, leave ag alone, leave beef alone, because what we have now is excellent. And so that's important for us. And to put it into a Nebraska perspective, so most of the production and the harvest capabilities in Canada are in Alberta. And so if you look at a map and you look at where Alberta and Calgary is, and then you look at their major population centers in Toronto and Montreal, Nebraska beef packing plants are half as close to those markets. So we actually have a decent amount of exports from the state of Nebraska that go into Toronto and Montreal. So we were thrilled that essentially there were no changes for beef interest on USMCA. Probably the biggest thing that was changed, Canada has strong subsidies to their milk production, and you can actually get dried milk delivered from Nebraska to Toronto cheaper than those domestic sales in Canada into their largest population. So milk was the biggest ag thing that was the focus by USTR in the USMCA relations and trade negotiations.
And then I was also wondering if you could explain the impact of the U.S. withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, and what a new administration may mean for the future of the beef industry.
So we were very disappointed 4 years ago when all the candidates were negatively talking about trade, because the opportunity to be part of TPP was exciting on what could happen. And there's no perfect trade agreement, because you have to give something to get something. So about the U.S. getting into TPP. So obviously President Trump is a very aggressive person. So he was telling people in ag space that he wanted a bilateral with Japan, which is they in Korea, South Korea are really the focus of where we can grow our exports. And so to get that bilateral done was huge. But other markets and nations to have focus on are the Philippines. There's great opportunity there. Vietnam, we've hosted and we've been on trade missions to Vietnam in the last 18 months. And so anytime you have trade that in all likelihood creates a positivity between countries, interaction and working together. So we like to think in beef that we can be a vital part of that in giving a good view of what Nebraska is and how we interact around the world.
Again, participants, feel free to use the Q&A chat feature, and when asking your question, just add your name and SICE affiliation. And then with American foreign policy, what would you say the typical Nebraskan sees as priorities for the country and the state?
Well, where agriculture is the biggest industry in the state of Nebraska, ag exports are significant, if not considerable, in the sense when we only have 1.95 million people, even our production throughout our country helps, but exports markets, whether it be corn, soybeans, wheat, beef, pork, we profit immensely by it in Nebraska. And so from that standpoint, trade is always going to be a real strong consideration on what we need as producers in our state. And so trade can be obviously, depending on a political perspective, a lightning rod for negativity. But I think when you have people that are progressive and they look to the future to try to increase markets, increase profitability, because margins are very tight. It doesn't matter what beef or what ag export there is. The reality of it is the opening of export markets comes back and helps rural America, in this case, Nebraska, to be stronger. And so I know that's somewhat of a generic answer, but it's obvious that we need for Nebraska agriculture and specifically beef access to foreign markets even greater than we have today.
And can you also talk about the impact of bilateral versus multilateral markets and its impact to producers? So for example, selling to Canada and Mexico versus the different Asian countries, are there major structural frictions dealing with these markets governed by different treaties, or are they transparent to the producer?
Excellent point and an excellent question. So the easy and obvious one to draw distinctions on the specifics of trade agreements is with the EU. So the EU, for whatever reason, we don't agree with this, but they only, from a beef perspective, want non-hormone treated cattle. So if you're an EU member, you couldn't get traditionally produced beef in your country. So what is non-hormone treated cattle for the participants today? So for efficiencies and the technologies that we use, implants are given to cattle, and the primary active ingredient in implants to increase their production is estrogen. So as an example, Michigan State did one of the first studies on this way back in 1991. And so if you would think of an American football field and think of all the blades of grass in a football field, 9 blades of grass would be equivalent to the estrogen that's in an implant to increase the efficiency. I believe, if I remember correctly, asparagus, as an example, I believe has 35,000 nanograms of estrogen in a serving of asparagus. You know, a pregnant woman, I believe, is like 45,000 grams units of estrogen. So we think it's a trade barrier with the EU that they won't let us export traditionally produced beef to their countries. And it's always amazing to us when they come and visit our countries, they eat our beef and they love it. So, you know, that to us validates that they look at this more as a trade barrier than opposed to an opportunity, and it's restricted by their health standards. So for our standpoint, that's one thing that's exciting about Brexit. If it does happen and we can have a trade agreement with the UK, that the hope is that non-hormone treated cattle will not be the standard for the beef exported to the UK as what is currently in place in the EU. So hopefully that answers your question, Deja. But that is in me, that's probably the easiest example to answer that question.
And then how do you see the future of the beef industry in Nebraska with the declining population in rural Nebraskan counties? Are there still enough employees to keep these farming operations going?
Yeah, so fair question. And obviously with how technology, especially in machinery, has happened, that is a great way to be more efficient and reduce the need of labor. But when you work in agriculture, it's a known fact, and all my colleagues on here grew up in agriculture, it's hard work. And you can't you can't just go home Friday and come back to work on Monday. You have to, when caring for animals and to a lesser degree crops, you have to give them attention 7 days a week. As an example, we had a blizzard in Nebraska the Christmas of 2009, and it extended over 2 days on Christmas Day and afterwards. So there was many beef producers and ag producers that did not celebrate Christmas in 2009 on Christmas Day because they were out taking care of their cattle. And that's our life, that's our commitment, and we're 100% focused on that. So that is an example of where that lifestyle may not be for everybody. And so as we've seen immigration, it's a typical scenario where we have workers in those plants that come from Mexico, they come from Guatemala, and they get here and maybe they don't really like that work, even though they've come from an agrarian background, and they want to work on a farm, they want to work on a ranch, they want to work in a feedlot. So that's where it goes back to a policy perspective. What my membership did in relation to immigration is impactful, as we want to see the bigger picture, and we want people, regardless of their skin color, to be part of our lifestyle and our operations. And so hopefully, something like that can happen that helps us. But all these things that we see from a political realm do come back and affect us in agriculture, and specifically beef in Nebraska.
Are there any infrastructural issues at the national level that limit trade or inhibit trade?
I don't think so. Maybe my colleagues can answer it, but I mean, knowing that beef is such a big part of the American agricultural demographics, that regardless of administration, it's always been a real integral part of negotiations. So I really don't see this, from a party perspective, if you will, because the previous U.S. trade representatives, ag ambassador was from Nebraska, Darcy Vetter. Darcy is a very talented lady, very sharp lady, and she can go in with the most aggressive people in the world and negotiate. So when you have that connection with USTR in any administration, we feel that we're in a decent spot. So it's up to us from the ag groups to be there and be supportive in the process to increase our exposure in markets.
And could you briefly explain some of the legislative priorities of the Nebraska Cattlemen on the national level? I know that you've had experiences with your experience as the Vice President of Legislative Affairs on the state level, but does Nebraska Cattlemen deal with any major, of course, trade priorities of the on the federal level?
Yes, so obviously, as I alluded to earlier, we are a state affiliate of our national association, National Cattlemen's Beef Association. So we feel like we have a strong voice. Obviously, we do with our 3 congressional elected officials and our 2 senators, but obviously there's strength in numbers. And so to be out there and promote our members' policy through our national association is critical. And so because beef is big in Nebraska, Nebraska is looked to within our national association on being really active in trying to develop specific policies regardless of the issue. So one of the things that this administration, just concluding, they dealt with an issue that affected all of us in agriculture, was the previous administration had put in place Waters of the U.S., which in our opinion had more of a national control of water usage. And so that was a little scary. So as I talked about earlier, we established, I believe in 1973, a system of government in Nebraska to essentially manage water. And it's called our natural resource districts. And so we do an excellent job in managing water usage in our state. To what I said earlier, there's parts of our state where the water table is growing. we're in the same Ogallala Aquifer in Texas. They've essentially mined water, and hence their water table is going down dramatically. So when that got repealed by the Trump administration, that was a very secure effort to give our producers, regardless of ag production, the ability to know that what we've aggressively done in Nebraska will not be controlled by our federal government. You know, if you're going to talk about how people live and what they need and the stability that they have to have, healthcare is obviously a huge thing nationally, and it's no different for us in Nebraska. And so trying to offer viable, needed healthcare coverage for families and workers has gotten really challenging, if not exorbitant, on the monies that owners of operations are providing to support their workers and keep them employed and not have them walk across the road to the neighbor. That's a big issue that we're a part of. And obviously for the topic of this conversation, trade is always that push to keep our markets open and grow them. So those would be some things on the short list of what we're looking at on a federal level.
Great. And earlier you mentioned the aquifers in Nebraska. I was wondering if you could expound upon the environmental issues in Nebraska and its relevance to the beef industry.
Thank you. Glad you reminded me of that. So for example, one thing that's ecologically unique to Nebraska is our sandhills. And so 250 years ago, when explorers came out, they called the sandhills in Nebraska the Great American Desert because of the migratory pattern of buffalo. The grass did not really take hold, but when beef producers 150 years ago came to Nebraska and they brought cattle and started managing their ground, the grass became prevalent. And so that is essentially the headwaters of the Ogallala Aquifer, because if you think about it, it's sand, the water, the rain, the moisture goes down into the aquifer and replenishes it. And so we do an excellent job. Another little fact about Nebraska is we have a little over 79,000 miles of rivers and streams in our state. I believe it's 1 million acre feet of water comes in from the Rockies, and I believe it's 5 or 6 million acre feet exit the state primarily into the Missouri River. So we're extremely fortunate that not only the Ogallala Aquifer, but the runoff that comes through our rivers and streams really helps to provide a stable of ag environment, whether it be ranching and watering cattle as opposed to our crops. And so that's really important for us to do the right thing and keep sustainability in mind on managing our resources. So the Sandhills is an absolutely gorgeous place, but it is very rural in terms of population. We have some counties that are typically 25 miles by 25 miles that have 400 people in them. Those are ranchers, essentially. They're taking care of their cattle. So how we manage our water it has a cost. It is a tax that creates the support to these natural resource districts, but in reality, the net result on managing our water has been terrific. So that all goes into who we are and what our environment is and how we can grow it, improve it, as opposed to what we gained from our previous generations.
And as future foreign policy practitioners here at SAIS, I was wondering if there are any policies or specific focus areas that you would like for us to think about as students at SAIS, and explain how they impact the Nebraskan beef industry.
So as I said earlier, I believe that the great thing about active and as fair as possible trade relations, it goes well beyond what the actual trade elements are for specific products. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind, that we can have a positive impact, for our producers and how markets can grow and be more vibrant. And it also helps our country to have better relations. So an emerging market, and I hesitate to say emerging because it's always been there, but it has become more active in terms of what the possibilities are, is Africa. And so there are countries there that have the financial means to start doing business with the US, and beef can be a part of that. And that goes back to products that we typically, as American consumers, don't typically desire, but some of these foreign countries that want some of our products, those products are typically things that we don't eat. So that provides more value to the overall beef carcass, and how it can help us get into future markets. So, but the reality of it is, we like to think we're part of the bigger picture of agriculture in beef. And so what's good for corn obviously has, good impacts for us in beef. So I think all of my colleagues on this webinar know that trade is vital for what we do. So hopefully that answers your question, Deja.
Yes, and again, participants, feel free to use the Q&A chat function to ask your questions. And also your SICE affiliation, we welcome any questions that you may have. What is one thing that you believe, aside from trade, people from outside of Nebraska or the Heartland in general, so people from the East or West Coast, what is one thing that you believe people have a hard time understanding about Nebraska, or something that is underrated or misunderstood about the environment or the industries in the state?
And that's a very good question, because it doesn't matter what industry you're a part of, not everybody thinks the same way. So clearly there's some producers in our country and in Nebraska that they would rather have more of a focus on not having trade and utilizing every bit of the carcass, all the products, and have those be the primary focus of what our consumers and our processors look at for how we provide value. And so, as I talked about, beef livers, $1 a pound in this country, as opposed to maybe $5 in some other countries per pound. And so to us, that's a very narrow-minded viewpoint. And in my realm, the way we distinguish that is, we at Nebraska Cattlemen, our policy strongly focuses on being beef producers. In other words, we want to take ownership from when the production starts all the way to the consumer, whether that be a US consumer or a foreign consumer. And we like to think that that differentiates ourselves from those that view them as cattle producers. And by that I mean, once they leave their ranch, once they leave their feed yard, they want somebody else to deal with it. They're not focused on what happens after their part of the production is done. And so that is a key distinction between that. So when you look at trade agreements, we are all in on looking at foreign markets. And so whether they're bilateral or multilateral, all those provide value. And so that's how we view ourselves. And we are very focused and disciplined on that point. And that may be minor to some of the viewers, but it is very important to us. And so that goes all the way through a trade negotiation from a rancher's operation.
Great. Thank you again, Mr. Mclemont, for joining us this morning. We will now transition to our second speaker, Mr. Jay Rempe. Jay Rempe is the senior economist for the Nebraska Farm Bureau. As the senior economist, Jay is responsible for agricultural economic outlook, policy analysis, research, and education programs. Prior to being the senior economist, he served as the Vice President of Governmental Relations for Farm Bureau. Jay has a long career working on agricultural issues at the state and federal levels with expertise on the school finance, trade, regulatory, and water issues facing farmers and ranchers. Jay earned a Master's of Science degree in Agricultural Economics at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. He also received a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture from University of Nebraska at Lincoln as well, majoring in agribusiness. Prior to earning his master's degree, Jay worked in Omaha as a commodity merchandiser. Thank you so much, Mr. Rempe, for joining us.
You bet. Thanks, Deja, and welcome everyone to the great state of Nebraska. Sorry you couldn't be here in person. We have a lot we'd like to show you if you could have been here. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to be part of this discussion, and I look forward to the discussion. Excuse me, and the questions. As Dacia mentioned, I am an economist with the Nebraska Farm Bureau. Just a bit of background about Nebraska Farm Bureau, what we are and what we try to do. We are a general farm organization in the state of Nebraska. But when I say general farm organization, I mean that we are an organization that represents a variety of different producers in the state of Nebraska. We have producers all across the state, and they can produce anything from beef, as you just talked about with peat, or corn, soybeans, but also sunflowers, canola, sheep, pork, the variety of things. And we are a voluntary organization. Farmers and ranchers across the state pay a fee or a dues to belong to us. We probably have roughly about 13 to 14,000 farmers and ranchers that belong to the organization. And our mission in a nutshell is basically to represent their interests in political circles and but also in the greater public at large, and to be kind of their voice, the voice of agriculture within those various circles and areas. We also are affiliated with American Farm Bureau at the national level, where they do a lot of the similar things in Washington, D.C., and work closely with them on some of the issues that we work. In regards to foreign policy and how it impacts Nebraska, that obviously, as the previous conversation noted, trade is one of the first things that come to mind. And there was a study done, or some research done by the Yider Institute here at the University of Nebraska that looked at foreign policy issues that Nebraskans felt important, and trade was the number one thing that they brought out. And that was largely due to the importance of trade and the role trade plays in our agriculture. To kind of set the stage on top or build on what Pete said earlier, if you look at the value of our ag commodity exports year in and year out, that value roughly equates to about 30% of the total ag receipts that we receive, that our farmers and ranchers receive across this state. So it's a critical role. Generally, ag exports from the state of Nebraska will range from 6.3 billion to 6.8 billion, somewhere in that range, and that's just for commodities. And so things like corn, soybeans, beef. It doesn't include things that are related to agriculture. Like we have a pretty solid ag manufacturing, equipment manufacturing industry in the state of Nebraska. Things like center pivot irrigation systems, combines, and tractors and the like that get exported as well. These are just commodities that I'm talking about. And we are the sixth largest state in terms of our ag exports as reported by the USDA. But when I think about the population of the state of Nebraska, Pete mentioned we have 1.9 million people. The states that are above us are states like California, Texas, Illinois, Iowa, all states that have a lot greater population. So I like to think that we in Nebraska do more with our population in the way of ag exports than almost any other state in the nation. So trade obviously is something then that we as an organization do a lot of work around it. And we've really ramped up our efforts in the last few years because of the elevation of trade, I guess you will, by the Trump administration, and the 2016 elections really elevated the issue of trade to the forefront. And obviously some of the actions by the Trump administration over the last few years has done that too. So we've really tried to, at the same time, elevate our level of activity in the trade arena. And when you look at one of the things that came out of the IDER Institute, while a lot of Nebraskans understand trade is important to the state, and they understand that it's important to agriculture in the state, they really don't know how their economic interests are impacted by trade. And so one of the things we try to do is try to bring that home a little more, or I try to do in my role here as an economist. We started about 4 or 5 years ago issuing an annual report on Nebraska's commodity exports. We take the USDA numbers once they provide their estimates of how much corn we exported from Nebraska, how much beef we exported. What we try to do is break that down a little bit further. And when you talk about amounts of 6 to 7 billion, it's hard for most Nebraskans, if you're not Warren Buffett, to relate to billions. And so we try to break it down and apportion that out to Nebraska counties based on their productions in those counties to give them a little bit of a flavor of what it means to a county to say that we have $6.3 billion worth of exports from the state of Nebraska. We also try to break it down by commodities as well to give folks in a county the sense that, okay, soybeans is the top export commodity that comes out of your county that you produce. So you need to pay attention to soybean markets worldwide to get a sense of what's happening there. And or beef or corn, those kind of things. So we try to do that. The other thing we've done, obviously with some of the trade disputes that we've been in over the last few years, we've done some studies and some analysis to show what that means to the state of Nebraska in general, but also to, more importantly, I guess, to our producers across the state. Again, 30% of their receipts, or the value of exports, make up 30% of their receipts. So it's definitely going to have an impact, some of these trade disputes that we've been involved in. And so we've tried to bring that home and do some analysis to show what that means in the way of its impacts to the state of Nebraska and to agriculture. And then as Pete mentioned, we are always looking to expand our markets and working to participate in things that we can do to expand those markets. And so we'll participate in trade missions overseas, both through our governor and his efforts to expand Nebraska trade, but also through our national organization, American Farm Bureau. And we will host foreign delegations when they come to the state of Nebraska to show what trade is about, and try to show them what we in Nebraska can do and provide information about Nebraska, I guess, if you will. And then lastly, in related to trade, we get involved in a lot of policy discussions around the trade arena at the national level, and in events like this. We've been very active supporters over the years of free trade agreements. I think the last couple that, if I can recall correctly, that passed were Colombia and maybe Peru. We were very active in working our congressional delegation and trying to see those agreements passed. We are very active in wanting to provide the president with the Trade Promotion Authority, where he can, and his administration can negotiate with foreign countries and governments, and then bring it back to Congress for an up and down vote. We think that's a very good way to try to move forward in the area of trade. We always take trips to Washington, D.C., and nearly every time we'll meet with the Trade Commission and their negotiators, particularly their ag negotiators, to impress upon them the importance of trade. So we're very active in that whole arena of trying to support and move forward trade. One of the things that we're kind of watching closely, and I don't think this is so much on farmers and ranchers' minds across the state right now, but it's more on our minds internally as staff, is the deterioration of the World Trade Organization over the last few years and what that means to agriculture. If you look at ag trade in the country, and then it trickles down the state of Nebraska, and the growth in WTO and its growth over years, there's definitely a relationship there. We've seen ag trade grow tremendously with the WTO and its ability to serve as that institutional structure and provide certainty and transparency in some of these trade issues. And to see that deteriorate now, and wondering if something's going to step up to take its place is certainly an issue that's out there for us that we're watching and concerned about, and particularly as it comes to China. And WTO wasn't really designed to handle some of the issues that China presents as it's emerged onto the world scene, both as a major trade partner and as a growing economy. And so how the United States in particular, but other countries that are our friends and allies across the world, how we deal with that, I think, is particularly important for agriculture, and that's something we'll be watching closely. The last thing I guess I'll mention, and Pete already mentioned this too from a foreign policy standpoint, is immigration. And when you look at the state of Nebraska and our population, we have not been growing very fast, very slowly, but where we are seeing the growth is through foreign immigrant labor coming into the state of Nebraska, not only in agriculture, but our manufacturing sector and other sectors. And so that's one area that when you talk to folks is very important to deal with our workforce issues in the state of Nebraska, and particularly finding skilled labor and labor that is willing to do some of the jobs that Nebraskans aren't willing to do, I guess. And so that's one that we watch very closely too and get involved with. To some extent, we were very heavily, I'd say heavily involved, but we were part of discussions American Farm Bureau was, and we were working through them a few years back when there were some major immigration reform efforts underway. Unfortunately, those have kind of dwindled now, but that's something that as a state, and particularly agriculture sector in general, that we need to continue to work on to provide some more workforce and labor issues to handle those here in the state of Nebraska. So Daisha, with that, I think I will be quiet, and I'd be happy to answer any questions and engage in the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much for providing us with that overview. Again, participants, feel free to ask your questions using the Q&A chat box. We actually have one question for you to start off. On ag tech, are you seeing technology playing a huge role in the farming industry and in trade? There's been a large explosion in the technology in the state with crop management and planning and implementing equipment. And do you see technology increasing Nebraska's attractiveness overseas as we move forward?
Let me answer that in a couple different ways here. I think on the trade front, one of the things that I think excites me a little bit in terms of technology is the whole blockchain technology. And I don't pretend to understand it very, very well, but my understanding is that you can engage in a transaction with somebody in another country, and you can all both log this transaction into a blockchain, and that product, that commodity, all along the way until it gets delivered, you can track it. There's a lot of transparency. There is more certainty in terms of the financial and the payments involved and those kind of things. And I think that opens up some opportunities for Nebraska producers in the future, because typically today what happens, a producer is not directly engaged in international trade. They typically sell their grain or their cattle to a processor or to an elevator who turns and sells it to somebody else. And probably by the time it gets shipped overseas, it's been traded 4 or 5 times before you reach somebody that's like a Cargill or a Bunge or somebody like that, that then has the wherewithal, can withstand the risks involved to sell that product overseas. And so I think blockchain technology is maybe one way where we can see some more direct linkages between producers in the state of Nebraska and buyers overseas. So that's one area I see technology coming in. The other is, you're exactly right on, we're just seeing the last 10 years an explosion, literally just an explosion of technologies that are being used on the farms and ranches. And some of that is due to some of the labor issues I just mentioned, and finding it hard to find the labor. So we're finding a lot of ways to use machinery and technology in place of labor. And a lot of what we're seeing in the way of technology, new mapping, new monitoring, new sensors, gathering data on the field and the ground or the field itself and what's happening to the plants, using that data, trying to make decisions on nutrient applications, on pesticide applications, on water applications. And we're finding that we can grow a crop and use the chemicals and the water a lot more effectively and efficiently. And it saves money both for the farmers, but also it's good for the environment too, as well. Just yesterday, I was on a Zoom discussion where we were talking about some of these kind of things, and what really struck me, one of the researchers at the University of Nebraska that's engaged in this said that right now we're focusing on managing. It used to be if you were a farmer, you just tried to manage the field. If it was 80 acres, 100 acres, you tried to manage the field as a unit. Here in recent years, we've gotten down to where you're trying to manage each individual acre with the new technologies and the sensors and the data that we gather. We're eventually going to get to where we manage each individual plant. And so when you think about that, in a typical field in Nebraska, there are probably 6 million individual plants. So the technology and the data that we can bring to bear on that to manage each individual plant is just amazing when you think about it. But yeah, so it's definitely something that we're going to see here in the future.
Great. And then our next question is regarding one of the most recent reports released by the Nebraska Farm Bureau titled the Trade Agenda 2021, The Next Steps Forward. In that report, the Farm Bureau detailed the importance of the next administration's priority to expand international markets. Could you provide further information about the Bureau's latest report? And in addition to that, there was also a brief paragraph about the WTO and some of the changes that the Nebraskan Farm Bureau would like to see within the WTO.
Right. Yeah, that was something we as an organization felt with the change of administrations, there was an opportunity to maybe reset the trade agenda a little bit or look into the future, what we might want to try to do. And so we tried to lay out some things that we thought the Biden administration could look at or pursue in the way of trade that we thought would be helpful to Nebraska Farm Bureau or our Nebraska producers. And there's 3 or 4 items in there. I'll maybe touch on a couple. One was China. And fortunately that we had the phase 1 trade agreement that was entered into in January a year ago. And we're seeing some, I think, combination of that agreement, but also market conditions. We're seeing China in the last few months come in and buy some products, which has been good and supported our commodity markets. But there's a couple things that we think that would be helpful, and I probably mentioned this, but producers, like other businesses, they want certainty and they want transparency. So if there's some way that we can normalize our trade relations with China, get there where we can have some certainty, know what the rules are that we're operating under as we move forward. The other thing with China, obviously, there's some issues with their state subsidies, their technology theft, and some things there that we need to work on. And our thought was, through the Trump administration, we tried to do that unilaterally and take them on head to head that way. And we've had some success, but we think to take the next step, we need to use a multilateral approach. My understanding is that Japan, the EU, and I think maybe South Korea and some other countries are working or discussing collectively ways that they could approach China or design some rules around some of those issues about state subsidies and technology issues and the like. And I think it'd be important for the United States to be part of those discussions and work on a multilateral effort with China. In regards to the WTO, I mean, there's a couple things that we think that could be done. One is that one of the issues was that because the United States wouldn't agree, that, well, the appellate body now that the WTO has that countries can take their cases to is largely out of business right now. And that's because we don't have enough judges or arbiters on the appellate body. And the United States has been holding up appointments to that body because of some concerns we have with WTO. But we think it's important to move forward with appointments, find some people that we can get on there. And because that appellate body has been important for agriculture, we've raised a number of issues over the years with other countries' trade policies in regard to agriculture. And we've been successful in that regard. I think 97% of the time we've been successful. So I think that's important. The other is to look at, okay, what's the world has changed a lot since the WTO was put in place. I think, and what can we do, or working with collectively with other countries, we need to change WTO to make it reflect of how the world is changing and the new technologies and how trade is changing. And I think that's another key important thing that in agriculture, again, we benefited greatly from having that institutional structure in place, and we need to try to adapt it to what's happening in the world and move forward.
Great. I've also inserted a link to the report referred to, the Nebraska Farm Bureau's report titled The Trade Agenda 2021 Next Steps Forward, into the chat box. Relating to China, what is the impact of bilateral versus multilateral trade? And from your perspective, have you seen that producers are desiring a single market or smaller ones, or is it a relevant aspect?
Interesting question. I think producers, with China, it's kind of a double-edged sword. They represent a real potential market, particularly for agriculture. When you look at their growing population, their protein needs that growing population is going to need, the rising incomes, it's just such a potential there that they want to be involved in that market, be able to take advantage of that market. But at the same time, they understand and they know that China presents some issues, not only within the economic realm, but the political realm and the defense realm. And I think they want to make sure that those are addressed as well. And so there's this prize that's hanging out there, if you will, in terms of really great markets, but it comes with some baggage, and that concerns them a little bit. So given what's occurred over the last few years with China, and I'll pick on soybeans a little bit. China is the world's largest importer of soybeans. Soybeans, it's beginning about 6 or 7 years ago, has been the top export commodity from Nebraska. About half of our soybean crop typically is exported. And obviously a lot of that goes to China. So when we had started the trade dispute with China, we saw soybean exports drop off, and that affected our producers very directly. And so as a result of that, we realized that we're too reliant on that market for China. And so there's been a lot of work done on trying to work with bilaterally with other countries or promote the work of the Trump administration bilaterally with a lot of other countries to find their smaller markets in China, but they offer some diversity and they offer some potential risk management to offset that if things go haywire with China again, we have a bit of a backstop. So it's kind of like I said, a double-edged sword, and I think our members or our producers are interested in trying to continue to move forward with China as a market, but at the same time, they want to diversify and find some protections there elsewhere.
And then a follow-up question regarding China. Do you believe that China's shift to South American producers will be permanent? And how do you see the export market outlook in Nebraska within the next 10 years?
There will be some permanency with China's shift to South America in the sense that they've established some relationships there. They have invested a lot of money in facilities and infrastructure in South America, Brazil, and Argentina. And so those markets will be very competitive for us in the future. So we're going to have to work hard to continue to service that market in China for our soybeans and other commodities and products. But at the same time, China and their purchasers and their country are very savvy marketers, very savvy producers or purchasers. And there are times, like right now is one of them, where South America is going to have some production issues and problems where the way the exchange rates and the prices of our product are very competitive, and so they will purchase our product and our commodities. So it's going to be very competitive into the Chinese market over the foreseeable future. The one thing, it's not a stable or a shrinking market or a stable market in the sense it's going to be a growing market. Their population is growing. They had an issue with African swine fever and their pork production there. They lost a lot of pigs because of it. They're growing their swine herd again. They eat soybeans and soybean meal, and so that market will be growing. So there's some potential there. And I think in terms of overall ag exports in the future over the next 10 years, I particularly in the Asian markets with the population growth and the income growth, if we can get through this COVID pandemic, get through the economic shocks and to the systems of that, I think there's a lot of potential, particularly for our livestock producers, both beef and pork, looking into those markets. And Vietnam, Pete mentioned, but South Korea, Japan, and some of the other countries, I think there's a lot of potential there. And so I'd like to think that overall, we're going to see the trend upwards continue to grow, particularly if we can work through some of these hiccups and trade disputes that we've had. I think the economics are there to see some growth. It's just politically, can we get out of our way?
As a follow-up to South America, what are your thoughts on renewables going forward? With Brazil having an influence on cellulosic ethanol, for instance, do you see ethanol, biofuel, wind energy still playing a role in trade moving forward?
I think we will. I think particularly for Nebraska being a large ethanol production state, here domestically, we're going to see the ethanol demand pretty much stabilize and top off. With the COVID and people driving less, I think I saw the figures the other day that gasoline consumption is about 12% below prior year levels. So that means ethanol demand is about 12% low prior year levels. So we're going to have to explore and look at other alternatives. And prior to some of these trade disputes, we did see ethanol start to work its way into the international markets. I know China was a buyer, EU was a buyer because of the clean food fuels, and it can help them meet some of their goals in terms of climate change and the like. So I think there is a potential role there for ethanol. As we see more in the long term, though, as we see countries, the United States and other countries move away from fossil fuels, in the long term, that causes me a bit of concern for some of the ethanol renewable fuels. In Nebraska, solar, I think, and wind energy also are. I don't know how much in the way of international trade that there'll be so much of an issue. It could be in the sense that as other countries and other consumers across the demand more sustainable products, and they might, because we're seeing more and more wind energy development in the state of Nebraska, more and more solar energy, it might give us a little bit of a leg up in terms of trying to meet some of those kind of demands.
Thank you. As a follow-up to a statement that you made earlier about the importance of bringing international changes to Nebraska, could you just briefly elaborate on the impact of immigration in the farming industry as a whole, covering beef, plant products, etc.?
Yeah, that right now, immigration is a key source of labor for agriculture in general. And I think we're seeing it not only, Pete mentioned on the livestock producers' farms, but other farming operations as well. And it's basic, excuse me, directly related to we're seeing rural population loss. And so we're trying to backfill that loss of labor pool with immigrant labor. And so we've seen, one of the interesting things is we've seen a bit of a growth in the local foods industries, or I should say industries, but local foods trends in the state of Nebraska. And we're seeing more and more vegetable produce growers in the state. And some of the larger ones, I think, are definitely on the front lines and trying to deal with some of these younger issues. The other are livestock producers. In fact, just last year, I was visiting with a feedlot manager in central Nebraska, and she said she spends more and more time trying to deal with the immigration system and trying to get employees into the state of Nebraska legally so they can work for them. And she said she spends an inordinate amount of time on that. And then last year visiting with a rancher that runs sheep out in extreme western Nebraska, and they bring shepherders in from Peru because they have a large shepherd or a lot of shepherds in Peru, and they're experienced, they know what they're doing. But they spend a lot of time trying to deal with the immigration system to bring shepherders. So it's hitting on a lot of different spots, and not only agriculture, but manufacturing and other industries in the state of Nebraska. So I think when you talk to people about immigration, they want some more kind of a streamlined, pragmatic approach to immigration that can allow them to meet their workforce needs, and yet make sure that everything's done above board and legally too. And we definitely do not have that now.
Great. Are there any shortfalls or limitations in terms of infrastructure that limit Nebraskan exports to both of the coasts in the United States?
Infrastructure is always an issue. I know nationally, American Farm Bureau spends a lot of time working on dams and locks, particularly in the river systems, to make sure that we can, particularly out the Mississippi River is big. And when you think about exports, agriculture exports, particularly bulk commodities, your corn, soybeans, wheat, and like, there's two primary points where that goes through the Gulf of Gulf ports down in Louisiana. So for Nebraska, then that means Missouri River and the Mississippi River, and making sure that the infrastructure that's necessary to take the barges down those rivers is there. But then the other is Pacific Northwest and then California ports. And so rail infrastructure is vital. And we're seeing a lot of investment here in the state in large loadout facilities that can handle the bulk commodities and as efficiently and as quickly as possible to get the trains loaded and shipped out to those ports. And so that all is vitally important. And when you look at the country, we have a lot of our infrastructure is pretty old, and we need to invest in the upkeep and maintenance of that infrastructure to keep those afloat. That's frankly one of the advantages that we have on our competitors in South America is our infrastructure. But I know they're working very hard to upgrade their infrastructures, and we need to do the same to make sure we can keep that competitive edge.
Great. I also have a question regarding the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Farm Bureau's suggestion for some sort of comprehensive approach to either rejoining or having a separate trade agreement with those Pacific countries.
Yeah, we were very disappointed when we pulled out of the TPP and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because we thought it opened a lot of opportunities, particularly in some of the Asian countries for our beef and pork products. And so one of our fears when we did pull out of that was that the world was not going to stand still and those countries would move forward without us. And that happened, and that became the CPTPP. And so we did see that. I think Pete mentioned this, but there were some countries where we were put in a place in a competitive disadvantage. Japan and beef comes to mind, but also Vietnam, where some of our competitors like Australia, New Zealand, and some others had a competitive advantage into those markets because they were part of the CTPP. They got a lower tariff structure than we did. And we saw the results of that in our beef exports over, I think it was 2018 into first part of 2019. Fortunately, the United States entered into a bilateral agreement with Japan that removed that competitive impediment. But I think that's, from our vantage point, that's a hard way to go about it, and trying to negotiate with each individual country that are part of CPTPP to try to regain our competitive stature in those markets. So from our point, we would like to see the United States, it was a leader in bringing the TPP together to begin with, re-engage with those countries, and hopefully it's not too far along where we can't. I would think those countries would like to work with us because of our economy and our market that we can bring to bear, and move forward and see if there's a way that the United States can become part of that. And that way, then we can work with all those countries.
Great. And as a final question before our break, as current SICE students, I'm wondering what you would like for us to take away from the economic outlook of Nebraska, and thinking about how we should approach American foreign policy by keeping states like Nebraska in mind.
Mm-hmm. I guess probably the biggest message I'd like to impart on, even though we are in the middle of the country, we're pretty far removed from the coast in terms of the population and things that are happening. Yet foreign policy is critical to us, particularly as our trade has dominated our discussion. But foreign policy is critical, and both from a trade standpoint and the immigration standpoint. So when as your students, as you're graduating and moving off into the world, remember that some of the things that you're working on and some of the things that you'll be involved with, the people in the middle of the country thank you for that, and remember that we're very much affected by what you do and how you move forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Rempe, for your time this morning. So now we will transition into a short 10-minute break. And after our break, we will introduce our next guest speaker. Everyone, and welcome back to the American Foreign Policy Program Heartland Trip. Our next guest speaker is Ms. Kristen Hasbrook of the Nebraska Chamber of Commerce. As the Executive Vice President of Legislation and Policy, Kristen Hasbrook lobbies at the state and federal level on behalf of Nebraska's businesses. She also engages in issues management with regulatory agencies that regulate Nebraska's businesses. Kristen is a graduate of the University of Nebraska and the Nebraska College of Law. Thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Hasbrook.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Again, I'm Kristen Hasbrook, and welcome virtually to Nebraska, everyone. Glad to have you on the call. You know, as Deja said, I am a native Nebraskan. I'm an attorney by trade, and I primarily work in legislation and policy on behalf of the Nebraska Chamber. The Nebraska Chamber is our state's largest trade association, and we represent businesses of all sizes, types across all of our communities. So large manufacturers, multinational corporations, down to mom and pop Main Street, businesses. As I prepared to talk to you all today, I looked at the panelists and saw some, great colleagues and experts. And I thought I would sort of give some thoughts on agriculture, but also ag manufacturing and the impact of foreign policy here in Nebraska. The Nebraska Chamber not only serves as the U.S. Chamber's representative in Nebraska, but also the National Association of Manufacturers representative in Nebraska. And so manufacturing makes up a large chunk of our membership. And so we're always paying attention to issues that impact that sector. Probably something that you've already begun to take away, or if you know much about Nebraska, is that Nebraska does have quite a production-oriented economy, and that's true both in agriculture, but also sort of other areas. We do also have some, significant service-oriented production too, especially in finance and insurance. But really, truly, between ag production and manufacturing, the Nebraska economy is quite production-oriented. And so when you think about sort of big ticket foreign policy issues, as you've heard this morning, trade and then immigration are key, to impacting a production-oriented economy. In Nebraska, just some refresher of stats from we've heard this morning, or maybe not, there's about 300,000 Nebraska jobs that have some sort of tie to international trade in Nebraska. We count almost 2,000 companies that export goods out of our state, and 80% of those would be considered small and medium sized. Nebraska in 2017 did about 11.7 billion in goods and services exports from our state. 6.48 billion of that, or about 80%, was manufacturing exports. And while I'm not sure where everyone's background is, in Nebraska, because we are such an ag production-oriented state, a lot of our manufacturing does also tie into agriculture. But we do have quite a robust, healthcare and pharmaceutical manufacturing as well. In terms of our top 5, top markets out of Nebraska for just exports in general, you've heard Canada and Mexico are key, and then we jump down to Japan, South Korea, and then China. I know that there is quite a bit of interest in China, it seems, amongst this group, and we can talk about that. But I think one of the things that I would highlight for folks is that, for Nebraska especially, Canada and Mexico are really sort of key when it comes to trade, especially trade policy for our state. Obviously, looking forward, markets in Asia are critically important. But in terms of sort of the current status of things, Mexico and Canada take up a lot more focus, I think, for Nebraska, businesses in terms of where their goods are going. When we think more about China, I think a lot of they are certainly a growing market or a target sort of market for opportunity. We have at the Nebraska Chamber with our manufacturing members, we have a lot of our membership that interacts with Asia on a daily basis through their supply chains or just other sort of components. And so that market is really critical from sort of getting to a final product stage for a lot of our members. In terms of what Nebraskans and what Nebraska businesses sort of perceive, like I said, sort of the two biggest issues are trade and immigration. And I think Jay Rempe mentioned this, but the University of Nebraska, along with Carnegie Mellon, recently did a really sort of robust kind of surfacing of Nebraska perceptions on all issues related to foreign policy. And so I would encourage you to seek out that report. It's really thoughtful and brings into play kind of where Nebraskans are in terms of what they see as impacting them from trade and foreign policy, but also their expectations. For Nebraskans, they're likely to report that the greatest impact to them is, do they have a good, stable job that pays them well? And again, we know in Nebraska, representing Nebraska businesses, Jay Rempe and Pete representing ag producers, that those jobs are often tied more closely to trade and foreign policy than the individual worker might realize. But really, truly, that's sort of the key way that most Nebraskans are thinking about, or the lens that most Nebraskans are thinking about trade and foreign policy. The Nebraska Chamber of Commerce is certainly engaged and supportive, in working with the U.S. Chamber, the federal delegation, encouraging, the federal government to, have free and fair trade sort of negotiations, obviously, across the country, across the world. Priorities for the Nebraska Chamber and our members, obviously, we would like to see as much sort of multilateral work as possible. We're also looking for the right amount of, technology protections and things of that sort, especially, as we look to the future. So some of the negotiations that have been happening around the world and some of the improvements in USMCA, some of the juxtaposition with China have focused around sort of technology and innovation issues. And those are things that we're paying attention to. A couple other things that I wanted to point out about Nebraska that might be unique compared to other places is I did want to talk about Offutt Air Force Base, and that issue is really top of mind right now in Nebraska. We were just recently competing to be the home location of Space Command on behalf of the U.S. government. And I don't think that a lot of people around the country probably think of Nebraska as a place where defense spending is impactful, but it is sort of especially in the Omaha metro area, it's a very important part of sort of foreign policy that I don't think people across the state generally, sorry, that was my office line ringing, generally think about, but it impacts the eastern part of Nebraska quite immensely and the economy around the Omaha metro area. In terms of sort of current issues impacting, there were some questions from you all about the impact of some of the tariffs and interactions with China most recently. There's some pretty good estimates out there. You heard from Jay Rempe and the U.S. Chamber that to Nebraska, the current trade war with China is probably impacting Nebraska exports anywhere between, 500 million to $1 billion in terms of sort of threatened products and impacts. And so generally, the Nebraska Chamber is quite concerned and wants to see sort of positive improvements in that arena. There is one area in which Nebraska is slightly unique. We do have a very large, sort of sector in Nebraska that produces steel, and so some of the tariffs have actually been viewed as favorable by Nebraska businesses who see that as something that's positive for their industry. Things that the Nebraska Chamber is sort of paying attention to moving forward. I think that that's where I really think sort of China comes into the mindset of at least the Nebraska Chamber and some of our members who engage with sort of trade on a daily basis or very intimately with their business, is sort of what does the future look like there in terms of their consumption, but also their role in, like I said, sort of our supply chains. And they're already, a dominant part of, supply chains into the U.S. And I think the world overall will shift somewhat to China, and will continue to do so as, as a market as a market opportunity. And so I think the United States and Nebraska is well positioned, but needs to be, thoughtful about what does it want to accomplish and what role does it want to play, what industries can we be successful in competing for. I think in Nebraska, as you notice, obviously, ag production is something that has to happen. You grow crops out of the ground here. It's important to have sort of a lot of your ag manufacturing then closely tied to some of that production. But we really need to think about sort of how do we ensure that high tech technology and innovation, sort of especially in automation and artificial intelligence and manufacturing sort of stays here, especially with concerns over technology in China in terms of companies that are based there, or what are some of their practices. I think the other thing that COVID has shown a lot of our manufacturers is that sort of medicine and pharmaceuticals are something that is probably an opportunity area, just because those are things that you want to have sort of very transparent production. You want to know that they are the best quality products and that you can get them sort of in a timely manner. That's a lot of sort of commentary based on what you guys had sort of fed me. I'm happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
Great. Again, participants, feel free to use the Q&A chat feature at any time during the conversation. So to start our conversation off, I'm wondering, I've asked the previous panelists this question as well, but you have a unique perspective with the Chamber working with both agriculture businesses and non-agriculture businesses as well. With the decline in the population of Nebraska's rural counties, I believe it's 80 out of the 93 counties in the state are considered as rural. How can foreign policy play a role in revitalizing some of the rural counties across the state? Do you see a potential for agritourism, even after the pandemic?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts there. I think probably the biggest component of foreign policy that can impact sort of Nebraska's population base is immigration, as the previous two speakers have mentioned. There's really no discounting the impact that can have in a variety of ways, not only just from a labor market perspective in terms of bringing, sort of workers, future Nebraskans to the state, but also in terms of, growth industries. When we think about, so it's not just, sort of the work visas, but also student visas, H-1B, sort of high tech visas into companies and things here. So I think that is, that's sort of leaps and bounds ahead and above atop sort of the impacts that foreign policy can have on Nebraska's population. I think one of the things that we are optimistic about in terms of population growth and Nebraska is certainly tied into agritourism, but more so just the ability to work remotely, to be spaced out, the opportunity to own property, own a larger home, feel very sort of safe and secure in your surroundings. Nebraska obviously is well positioned to provide a lot of that with our open spaces and rural communities. Sort of the cost of living here, can't be beat. Whether or not that's something that attracts, sort of international, workers, I'm not sure. I think they're probably coming more due to jobs or some sort of, opportunity that's tied to that. So I think from a Nebraska Chamber of Commerce perspective, we're really focused on comprehensive immigration reform at the federal level, and then making sure that Nebraska continues to create jobs. And I think there's a lot of times folks who say, well, why do you need to create more jobs if you just need more people to fill the jobs that you have? Well, that's part of that advertising sort of component in terms of continuing to get folks to invest and come here and be attracted, have a reason to think about coming to Nebraska. One of the other advantages I would just sort of put out that's to you all that's unique to Nebraska in terms of workforce is similar to just the fact that we are a production-oriented sort of economy. Nebraskans have some of the highest workforce participation rates, as well as highest rates of working multiple jobs. So I think in terms of, again, just opportunities for the state in terms of attracting, sort of businesses and jobs, we have some, our people have some entrenched ability, attractiveness too.
Great. Are there any shortfalls or limitations in terms of infrastructure that limit Nebraska's exports to both coast, as well as especially for the state's western half, which is considered as extremely very rural?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think, again, I would just highlight about Nebraska is while we are very rural, if you look at a map that has sort of our highways as well as our rail, Nebraska is really the center of what you could consider sort of a transportation and logistics sort of place. We are within a 2 days drive of every market in the United States, I believe. And trucking is a huge sort of, truck transportation is a huge industry here, and that we've serviced very well. We also have significant rail infrastructure that goes through the state. So I think we actually have more advantages than folks tend to realize. I think one of the things that we recognize at the Nebraska Chamber that we think is holding Western Nebraska back a little bit is we do need a bit more sort of what they would call sort of those more regional hubs, whether you have sort of rail and truck and maybe air intersecting. We have a decent amount of that in the eastern sort of Omaha-Lincoln metro area. We could really use a sort of a really vibrant sort of truck, rail, air hub in Western Nebraska. Again, Western Nebraska, while rural, has excellent, capabilities in moving products. They really, really do. And in distribution, there's some Scottsbluff and North Platte are very successful communities in that space. But I think that's sort of one, I would say, sort of infrastructure thing that Nebraska could really benefit from. I think air is another spot where Nebraska maybe isn't as developed, that is becoming more commonly used by businesses and just industries in terms of, at least in the U.S., and especially as you think about sort of export markets, sort of air. We don't have a massive sort of regional logistics airport, and so certainly that's an area where Nebraska could benefit from some additional infrastructure investments.
A follow-up regarding the labor shortage in the state. Those, could you address what the state chamber is doing about the issue of labor shortage in Nebraska?
Yeah, so I kind of talked about it a little bit. Obviously, we are advocates of comprehensive immigration reform at the federal level. That's just, just will have the biggest bang for our buck. We also are really focused, like I said, in the state in terms of encouraging, business investment and job creation. Two areas in which the Nebraska Chamber is very forceful in terms of business investment. Nebraska does lag a little bit in entrepreneurial sort of like startups. We have had great success when we do have them. We've been painted as the Silicon Prairie at times. I mean, numbers wise, we're just significantly smaller, but I think what businesses who have decided to sort of start up, or entrepreneurs who have decided to work, who are from here or build from here, have found is that Nebraska is a really great place to do that. You can easily get connected with a lot of people. Oftentimes the business community is extremely accessible. The regulatory and government, folks are extremely accessible, and want to see those startups, be successful themselves. There's also quite a bit of untapped, sort of financial opportunity here in Nebraska. Again, I think that's something that we would like to see sort of further cultivated. From having more venture capital opportunities for entrepreneurs and startups in Nebraska is really key. That's sort of one sort of piece that we're focused on, sort of developing more venture capital for the startup space. The other space in which we're focused on business investment, which again, more jobs, more workforce and labor, is the need to sort of really lean in on research and development, cultivation in Nebraska. I think because Nebraska is such a production, we've been so successful producing things, we do not have probably the amount of R&D investment from some of our largest companies, or just companies that have a physical presence here anyway. Some of that R&D is happening in other places, and that's something where Nebraska could really capitalize on. And so the Nebraska Chamber is really focused on expanding and encouraging R&D investment. Best way to do that is, at least from the Nebraska Chamber's capabilities, is through targeting that through the tax code. So sort of being a prime location where businesses can have a competitive tax advantage with their R&D investments. On the workforce side, so the true just worker side, obviously all the traditional mechanisms of encouraging job creation, but also one of the things that the Nebraska Chamber is leaning into right now is a focus on individuals who either have some connection to Nebraska, either they came here for their education, or they left Nebraska for a different job. I think, again, that's sort of a low-hanging fruit in terms of workforce development for the state, is really capitalizing on those folks who already have some awareness and tie to the state. So there's lots of different initiatives going on right now. There's a statewide branding initiative in terms of marketing and branding to those folks. There's initiatives at both the local and state level to create databases that would allow communities or businesses to tap into to recruit from those folks. The other piece about the other thing that I think is really, we don't have quite a solution yet, but one of the things that we see with population and workforce in Nebraska is that oftentimes our rural communities are the feeder workers for our metropolitan communities in Omaha and Lincoln, and that's fantastic. That's great. That's the natural migration. But then a lot of our Omaha and Lincoln, our sort of metro area, our urban communities, those folks are leaving the state. And so what would it look like, so we're really focused on job creation across the state, not just in our urban areas, because we'd like to see, not only, keeping, it's not like, communities are sort of stealing away graduates or people from our rural communities, but we'd like to see an opportunity for folks who want to come back to those rural communities, or folks who want to stay there, immediately after their education can do so. And then to think about what does that open up then in terms of recruiting and bringing in Nebraskans bringing to Nebraska people from outside the state who might be more attracted to our urban, their first introduction to our more urban cores is probably a more likely place that they might land. So I think it's sort of a dual strategy of continuing to grow rural Nebraska so that where a lot of Nebraskans might feel comfortable, so that and we can then grow a robust job creation and business in our urban cores that are potentially well suited to recruit from outside the state.
As a follow-up to that answer, I'm wondering if bidding, when international companies are seeking out different cities or states to implant their next business, I'm wondering what is the, how does the chamber approach a situation like that?
Yeah, so I think, that's one of the ways in which Nebraska is also a little unique in, the business community and the Chamber of Commerce, as well as, state elected officials, we're pretty hands-on in terms of economic development, business recruitment. I think you heard from several of the other speakers, they're going on foreign trade missions. Similarly, my boss is going and meeting, one-on-one with, potential, businesses who are either thinking about expanding or maybe locating to Nebraska. We participate very hands-on in terms of recruiting businesses to the state, as well as encouraging businesses that are here to expand. I think that's just a personal touch that Nebraska can offer. Nebraska also, obviously we have to have, prime sites. So one of the things, prime sites as well as utilities, worker, those sorts of things. So we also, we often work with economic development organizations, local communities, making sure that they have the resources to, whether it be to take ownership of land, have the resources necessary to, build that out from a site development perspective. So, we get engaged in that way as well.
Can you provide us with a recent example of a successful example of what you explained?
Well, I guess I would say and this one's just top of mind, so I did mention like Space Command. That's a good one. They did actually, their first selection was Alabama. They just announced that the other day instead of Nebraska, but we're still in the running because that decision can be switched. But the Nebraska governor, the University of Nebraska, and Chamber of Commerce representatives basically pitched, the U.S. Air Force together. So that's sort of like a public, sort of recruitment component. And the package that they pitched was land, free land that the Chamber of Commerce and the community sort of ponied up, a state investment that, the state could sort of pony up, and sort of a commitment of sort of research and faculty capabilities that the university brought to the table. So it's really sort of this unique, this really collaborative and accessible place. Last year, another example would be there's a credit card data processing company who was looking to, they'd been sort of consolidating at the national level and had a large presence here in the state. And, Nebraska was nimble enough to enact some legislation that sort of catered to their specific needs. And similarly, the Chamber of Commerce, key business leaders, mayors, were flying to the new execs who had, they just purchased this big company in Nebraska and have no idea about the state because they're based in New York, and sort of rolling out the welcome mat and sort of saying, like, we're already ahead of the game. Here's this newly enacted incentive package that we're ready to offer to you to keep those jobs here and for you to grow and locate more here. So Nebraska is really aggressive and hands-on and collaborative, I think, when it comes to working like that.
Great. Pivoting back to trade, I would like to discuss the consequences of the recent trade war with China with you. It has been costly, but the current administration has implemented subsidies. Are those subsidies working for the farmers and businesses, or do they want a stable trade relationship?
So, Jay is probably better positioned to answer sort of the on the ground impact of the farmer sort of subsidy components. A lot, I think that while they are appreciated, I think the perspective is while they are appreciated, obviously, free and fair sort of trade agreements around the world are always preferred. That is the way that the United States and Nebraska has always, been best positioned to compete. And that's our opinion moving forward as well. So, that's what we're looking for in terms of sort of the policy. We'd rather have that than sort of some of the fiscal policy stuff.
And then regarding just trade exports in general, specifically agricultural, since Nebraska is a large agriculture state, what are some of the most promising emerging markets for both commodities and equipment in the state?
Oh, actually, I'm not well versed in that particularly. Again, Jay and Kelly after me probably have a better handle on kind of what those emerging markets might be. I think one of the things that we are sort of paying attention to at the Nebraska Chamber is sort of what does sort of this more emboldened, stronger sort of China on a trade front sort of mean, not only for the supply of the things that we need in terms of components or supply chains, but then also sort of how do we do some of what they have done in Africa or South America in terms of making sure that we have access to whether it be natural resources or again sort of other parts of our supply chains to make sure that we can compete sort of globally as they sort of really continue to grow and ramp up their sort of influence. I think that's really the biggest thing of consequence and interest that we're paying attention to is kind of, I think there was just something I saw recently that, or like in this week where, China is like the one of the only, countries that's gonna, that they're on the rebound, they're already rebounding and growing, and especially in their manufacturing sector, where the US manufacturing sector is still depressed somewhat due to the pandemic. They, I think Jay mentioned, they have their most recent sort of regional multilateral trade agreement that, we're not a part of, but many of our sort of many of the folks that we consider key trading partners are a member of, and sort of how does that impact sort of things moving forward? So I think that those are some issues that are really top of mind for Nebraska businesses in the chamber.
And then thinking about the with the current pandemic in mind, how has this affected specifically Nebraskan businesses? And do you see a way for the chamber to collaborate with these businesses to improve their economic outlook, and any avenues for an international component to assist with the revitalization of small businesses and large businesses in Nebraska?
Yeah, so I think one of the key advantages for Nebraska is we throughout the pandemic we never sort of had any sort of shutdowns. Nebraska businesses remained open. We had a handful of Nebraska Chamber sort of manufacturers who maybe shut down for a week or two, either to get themselves situated or get the PPE necessary that they needed to sort of proceed. But then, basically since April 1st have been up and running, nonstop. And so I think that that's something that certainly has allowed us to be coming out of this pandemic with a little bit of an advantage, is that we aren't kind of crawling out of a hole in terms of either production or just knowing how to operate in kind of this new normal. I think that in terms of sort of growth opportunities, like I kind of mentioned, I think in Nebraska, we're focused a lot, at least from the manufacturing sector, focused a lot on what can automation and innovation do for our businesses, just because, one, we're short of workers. So obviously we need technology investments to be able to maximize that productivity in the near term. But also, again, sort of thinking about how can we position ourselves as a place where, if you're looking to create, some redundancy in your supply chain, Nebraska is a place where you can feel confident that your supply chain is going to be up and running, you're well positioned logistically, across the country, and we're super productive. So we're a good place for you to create that sort of redundancy if you're looking for that in your supply chain, perhaps to support other, U.S. companies. And then the other area I think is healthcare related. I think Nebraska has we have a strong showing in that regard in terms of healthcare and pharmaceutical production. And I think that's another area where we could sort of lean in and encourage greater investment.
Great. And I want to ask you a few more questions regarding your position as the Executive Vice President of Legislation and Policy. So from your role talking to legislators and the and Nebraskan business leaders, what are some things that you have found that Nebraskan business leaders think of when American foreign policy is discussed, and how do you convey that to the legislators that you talk to?
Yeah, I probably would return, a little bit to immigration here. I think that that's probably where our business leaders focus a decent amount of their attention in foreign policy, in terms of, I think that Nebraska is often perceived as a very sort of conservative political state, and we are, but when it comes to wanting to see a community, sort of thrive and survive, when it comes to filling job positions, people over politics, that's what happens in Nebraska. And so I think business leaders in Nebraska would be viewed as somewhat very progressive when it comes to immigration issues, because they see it as very much sort of the livelihood of art. Will they be able to sort of, keep their operations sort of running or expand here? And rural communities see it as, a pathway to continuing to have growth in their population. So I think that's probably the key area where, businesses are thinking about foreign policy and communicating that to legislators. So obviously then my job is to carry that, to legislators. And so again, while I think the business community is again somewhat seen as a conservative, entity at times, we're quite progressive when it comes to sort of immigration work. So.
And then one final question for you that I've asked to all of the participants is, what advice would you have for Sci students who are studying American foreign policy when thinking about American foreign policy and how to best represent all Americans, especially those in the heartland?
I think that one of the things that I would recommend is cultivating the capability to really take whatever it is that you're studying or whatever the issue is in foreign policy and really relate it back to, that individual experience. Like I said, I think most, individual Nebraskans probably aren't well-versed or aware of how impactful foreign policy and trade are to their livelihoods, because they're thinking about it from the lens of, I just want to make sure I have a good job that pays well, that has, that I'm able to take care of my family and have a good life. And so I think that skill is pretty critical, and explaining why we should care about what's going on in foreign countries, whether it be through what's happening with their trade issues, whether it's what's going on with their political institutions, whether it's some sort of new key, sort of industry or development. I think really sort of tying it back to almost a very basic and simplified sort of American or Nebraskan experience will be really critical moving forward, especially as we look to the fact that the U.S. is likely, we are not and are unlikely to be the center focus moving forward for the world. I mean, and so I think that's going to be a bit of a transition for a lot of Americans and Nebraskans, is that we're not sort of the center of attention at times. And so how do we also sort of navigate that and think about that? And maybe we can use that to our advantage too.
Great. Thank you so much, Ms. Hasbrook, for your time today. And now we will transition to our last speaker, Mr. Kelly Brunkhorst from the Nebraska Corn. Kelly Brunkhorst serves as the Executive Director of Nebraska Corn, overseeing the administration of both the Corn Checkoff Program and Membership Association. Kelly grew up on a farm and ranch in Nebraska and has held prior positions within the seed and grain and feed industries. Thank you so much, Mr. Brunkhorst, for joining us today.
Thank you. I assume you can hear me fine?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. I'm going to provide some opening comments, but let me first thank the group here and the team for allowing me to be part of this discussion. I'm sure you've heard a lot of information from some great individuals, from Kristen, from Pete, from Jay, and others. So I hope my comments are not duplicative or repetitive in nature, but if they are, it just underscores the importance of what foreign policy and specifically international trade has on the state of Nebraska. So let me open up and say that as we think about foreign policy, we automatically really focus in on international trade. This was supported by a study that the University of Nebraska did in cooperation with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And really, through those focus groups, individual interviews, and surveys, they've found that international trade was top of mind. And really, it connects with this large and strong economic driver we have in ag production. As you look at Nebraska in regards to our feedstock capabilities, so our corn production, we're nationally ranked number 3 in corn production. In soybean production, we're ranked in the top 5. So we have 2 great feedstocks that go into value-added industries, such as our beef industry, where we're ranked number 1 or number 2 annually on cattle on feed, and our pork industry, where we're ranked in the top 5 in regards to pork production. We have a growing poultry industry. And then once you take that and look at it from the standpoint of when those animals are ready to go to market, we have a very strong and leading the nation in regards to our processing industry. So we have this large agricultural complex that starts from the feedstock end, corn, soybean production, goes all the way through the processing end. Additionally, when we talk about foreign policy, we also think about immigration, and that's come up in a couple of questions already. Nebraska historically has had a tight or a low unemployment rate, and so we look at immigration and the need for immigration to be addressed so that we can continue to fill the needs of this agricultural complex that we have. 1 in 4 jobs within the state of Nebraska is related to this agricultural complex, and so we understand the need for immigration and comprehensive immigration reform to continue to address the opportunities that we have in regards to employment here in the state. So why trade? Well, we understand that, especially international trade. You may have heard the number already, but 95% of the world's population resides outside the state, resides outside the U.S. If you dig into that even more, 97% of the growth that's expected is outside the U.S. borders also. And so we need to continue to focus on the opportunities where we see the growth, not only in population, but also of the population that is moving into a middle class. As they move into a middle class, their desires to have a higher protein diet increases. And so because of that disposable income, so it again provides some fantastic opportunities for us. So what's it mean back to corn producers and this whole agricultural complex? Well, as we look at international trade and the value that international trade brings back to a bushel of corn, it's about a third of the price of the bushel of corn can be related to international trade for us as a feedstock. As we feed that in through the beef industry, about 13% of Nebraska's beef industry is exported, and that equates to about the value of $300 to a beef animal. As we look at our pork industry, it's about $60 per animal that's related back to trade, and they export about 30% of their production. As we look at value-added industry of ethanol, we continue to see the growth and opportunities in the international marketplace for ethanol. And so again, as we step back and look at international trade opportunities, it has really been this whole agricultural complex that is driving us as we look at it specifically from corn and as corn as a feedstock into these value-added industries. Free trade agreements and free trade, we have historically been a very strong proponent of free trade. As we look at corn in all forms going into international trade, over half of our international exports go into countries where we have free trade agreements with. And so that's why we have continued to advocate for increased opportunities for bilateral, multilateral trade agreements with countries around the world, opening up those markets or continuing to open up current markets that we have to greater opportunities for U.S. producers. Really what it comes down to for us is trade equals economic development. Whether you look at it from corn and soybeans going in as a feedstock into our value-added industries, such as our beef, our pork, poultry, dairy, ethanol industries, and those industries going into a leading processing industry, it's economic development. Economic development for us means jobs. And as you look at a $4 billion industry that's related back to international trade for the state of Nebraska, you can kind of understand why we continue to advocate for looking for these opportunities around the world where we can export our products into an international marketplace. So all in there because I would much rather answer questions that you all have to make sure that when you submit or finalize your reports and are done with today and tomorrow's webinar seminars, that you have the information that's really pertinent and informative for you. So appreciate the opportunity again and welcome questions, and I'll try to answer them.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Again, this is our last speaker, so feel free to put your questions into the Q&A chat box. You can ask any questions and indicate your size affiliation when asking questions. So I want to start off our conversation about agricultural exports and what are the most promising and emerging markets for commodities and equipment.
Sure, great question. So as we look at our current markets, we just look across the borders. To our north, we have Canada, and to our south, we have Mexico. With the passage of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement and it's coming into force in 2020, we believe those are two great, stable, and provide a fantastic foundation for us. As we look at new and emerging markets, we really look at Southeast Asia as a large area, but specifically as we look at Vietnam, we believe there's continues to be some expansion opportunities there. As we look at current markets such as Japan and South Korea, we believe those are two opportunities where we can continue to grow in some value-added market development there. So ethanol production, for instance, continuing to expand opportunities for our beef and pork exports into those markets. So, we have I would say we're inquiring into India to better understand that market opportunity for us in a number of different feedstocks and value-added products, and a little bit also into South Africa.
Great. And then as a follow-up to your introduction, if you could briefly explain provide an overview of what the Corn Board does and your role at the Nebraska Corn.
Yeah, great question. So the Nebraska Corn Board is the entity that administers the Nebraska Corn Checkoff. So from the beginning, when a farmer sells that bushel of corn into the marketplace for the first time, it's assessed a fee. And that fee comes into our budget, of which we work in 4 main areas. Those 4 cornerstones or pillars that we call them are market development, which obviously fits right into trade and international trade discussion. Research, so researching both efficiency and new uses of corn. Education, so it's education in regards to communicating and promoting our products into a younger demographic, but also into an international marketplace. So promotion obviously ties into a number of areas, or education ties into a number of areas. And the last area is promotion, which is connected very closely with education. We operate under a board of directors. They're all farmers themselves, so they have a vested interest in seeing continued opportunities of growth and market development that we undertake. And so they come in with a great perspective and passions in various areas where we work with a number of different cooperators. We work with domestic cooperators. We work with cooperators that have more of a national perspective. And then we especially work with international cooperators such as the U.S. Grains Council, U.S. Meat Export Federation, and others who have more of a presence in the international marketplace. And so as we talk to farmers and visit with them about their investment in the corn checkoff, we really say that your investment that happens at a local level because of the cooperation and partnerships reaches an international level. And so my role is somewhat to stay on the road of what they're doing, but also administrate the budget. Once they approve that budget, I work with a great team and staff of 6 of us all together that work in various areas. And my role to some degree is to stay out of their road too, because they're the ones that are really implementing this, the programs and the issues that we're addressing through our budget. We do also have a policy mechanism at the federal level. So we have relationships with our congressional members and work with other entities and partners to expand that opportunity for federal policy that would have an effect on international trade, but obviously a number of different national policies.
Great. With working with the Corn Board, what are some what would you say are some of the top priorities of the Corn Board from an American foreign policy perspective?
Yeah, so trade has been a huge part of our priority areas probably for several years. We continue to invest both financially and support, so I would say staff and travel opportunities where we're promoting our products. That is probably one of our biggest areas where we work on and continue to support and believe it provides us the best growth potential for demand. American corn growers are the leaders in regards to international production capabilities, and that's going to only continue to grow. So part of our role is to try and stay ahead of that growth and opening new markets and looking for those opportunities of which we believe happens internationally.
Speaking of trade, I want to ask you about the current trade war with China, and if the subsidies provided to farmers have been sustainable, or have you found that the farmers that you interact with would like a more stable trade relationship?
Yeah, great question. I'll address the second part of your question first and then circle back to the initial part of it. We've always stated that we prefer to get our margin out of the marketplace. We don't want our margin to come from the federal government because we become too reliant on that. So we would much rather have a stable and competitive opportunity for international trade, but also domestic policy too. So we would prefer to have more of that marketplace drive the opportunities for margin for producers across America and in the United States. In response to your question in regards to China, China has always been a fantastic opportunity and a large point of frustration for us all at the same time. Opportunity-wise, for a period of time, China was one of our leading destinations for distillers grains, which is a co-product of our ethanol production. They were taking an amount of distillers grains that was twice the number 2 country in Mexico for a period of time. All of a sudden, through tariffs and disagreements over trade, that market just went to zero overnight. And so really we lost an opportunity where we had additional revenue streams for our value-added industries, specifically our ethanol industry, that really went away overnight. We've had disagreements in regards to the opportunities for GMOs to be utilized within the China market, and has created some disruptions in trade around corn, specifically being exported into China. We believe we're hopefully in a much better position now with the phase 1 agreement between the U.S. and China. We have seen them come back into the market in a big way in regards to not only sales, but exports of corn into China this year already. And so our fingers crossed that relationship continues to build as we usher in a new administration.
As a follow-up regarding ethanol, if subsidies decrease due to the growth of electric vehicles, what impact do you see?
Yeah, great question. Let me just clarify too that the ethanol industry right now receives no subsidies. So, they're essentially competing in the marketplace similar to other products that are in the transportation sector, such as the oil and gasoline markets. In regards to electric vehicles, we continue to obviously watch that growth very closely, but we believe that long term there will still be an opportunity for liquid gas or liquid fuel market for us, and we will play in that. But we're also looking at the future. How can we look at electric vehicles not solely as 100% electric, but also a hybrid electric, and how do we play into that market of a higher blend of ethanol being able to capture the opportunities of a hybrid electric vehicle? But also, how do we look at ethanol being a feedstock into hydrogen-powered vehicles? So we're looking beyond where we're at today in regards to an internal combustion engine, and beyond electric vehicles into hydrogen opportunities. And what's that look like for the opportunities for ethanol to be that feedstock or that fuel into hydrogen vehicles? And so, it's part of that research arm and mechanism or pillar that we have, that we need to continue to search out, work with the auto industry and the kind of venture capitalists that are looking into the future of the transportation, and how can we play in that market, be active in that discussion, and take a role in kind of placing ethanol as an opportunity, or continue to be an opportunity in the future.
And can you briefly elaborate on the largest export markets in the corn industry for Nebraska?
Yeah, exactly. As I mentioned earlier, when I talked about our borders being key to us, Mexico is our largest trading partner as we look at corn, and especially as we look at corn from Nebraska. Over 300 million bushels of corn that's exported out of state ends up in Mexico. And so we continue to see that as a key market for us. But also we want to continue to grow that market too. And so we have great relationships with some key buyers down in Mexico. We not only do we do trade missions down there, but we do reverse trade missions so that we can showcase the production capabilities of our farming and our ag complex. So our farms and ranches, our elevator system, our delivery mechanisms in regards to logistics and transportation, and the opportunities it provides for efficiencies that can be utilized. And so Mexico is by far our largest trading partner for corn. Additionally, Nebraska is unique in that we have a lot of varieties of corn that we lead in production for. So for instance, white corn that you typically see in corn chips or tortillas made from corn. That's white corn. And Nebraska is a leading producer of white corn in the nation. And so we have a large stake in the white corn market. Over half of the U.S. exports of white corn go to Mexico. So we only assume that a large percentage of our production ends up in Mexico in the diets down there. We also know that there's capabilities and opportunities in African countries and in Southeast Asia for white corn growth there. And so we continue to look for and seek out those opportunities through market development avenues there. We also lead in popcorn production, popcorn that you see at the movie theater and stuff like that. And Mexico is a key partner for us, or a key destination for popcorn production too. We don't have any market development specific programs to that because they have their own industry, and really it's a small industry, but provides some great opportunity for our growers to diversify their operations.
With Mexico being the largest export market, can you elaborate on the effects of the new USMCA and how that has affected the corn industry in Nebraska so far?
Yeah. When President Trump started talking about renegotiating NAFTA, which was the preceding agreement, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, it was a preceding agreement prior to USMCA. We had concerns about that, but we also knew that there was opportunity because NAFTA was an agreement that was 25, 26 years old, and that the way in regards to commerce or logistics between buyer and seller has significantly changed within those 25 to 26 years. So much more of an electronic commerce was taking place. We also knew that because of the development of innovations and technologies, specifically genetic innovations, that we needed to update some of the provisions within USMCA as it deals with genetically modified organisms or GMOs and plant breeding innovations. And we also knew that there was other areas where we needed to update. Where we grew concerned with was when the announcement or some discussion take place that we may withdraw out of NAFTA completely. Mexico's growth from when we first signed NAFTA into effect, and through those 25 years, we saw a 5 to 6 times growth in Mexico being our largest customer for U.S. corn. And so we were rightfully concerned when we started hearing about the potential to withdraw from NAFTA. Obviously, that did not come true, but what we did see was NAFTA partners, so buyers down in Mexico, saying we need to make sure that we're diversifying our opportunities for corn purchases, and they started looking at other countries. And so there for a period of time, and it probably continues today, they started buying corn from Argentina and South America too. And so they moved away from U.S. being one of the dominant opportunities for exports down in Mexico to looking for other key sellers in the marketplace. And so that really concerned us. You know, where we're at today is we have a new agreement with the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. We continue to have, I think, some growth opportunities in Mexico, but hopefully it stabilized a relationship with a key trading partner with our Mexican buyers.
Earlier, we had a panelist, Mr. Jay Rempe from the Nebraska Farm Bureau, and we discussed the Farm Bureau's current trade agenda for the upcoming year. And in that, there was a report that was published as well. And in that report, the Farm Bureau had some concerns regarding the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and their appellate body and establishment of their current trade regulations. I was wondering if you or the Corn Board saw any issues at the WTO or with the U.S. trade representatives beyond the U.S.-China relationship and the USMCA.
I would say because of our partnerships and our cooperation with entities such as the U.S. Grains Council and U.S. Meat Export Federation, that we defer to them because they're much more ingrained and understand the workings of the WTOs, the opportunities, and obviously the challenges that it provides. So I would defer any comments to them, which, you know, they're not on this or part of this seminar, but really I don't have an in-depth knowledge of the WTO outside of the kind of general framework it provides.
And regarding China, what has, and competition with China, what has mostly directly had the most direct impact on the corn industry with that relationship?
Yeah, so I would say most recently because of the Phase 1 agreement and opportunities that has provided for the purchases of agricultural products in general, but obviously we more look closely at the corn industry and some of the value-added products that we're a feedstock into. It's opened up some great opportunities. I don't know if it was mentioned earlier by Mr. Pete Mclemont or Mr. Jay Rempe, but in regards to some exports of beef into China, Nebraska was one of the first states to provide some of the initial beef exports into China when it was opened back up. We, as I mentioned earlier, we continue to see some great sales of corn or purchases from corn by China in the market, and they're starting to take some of the exports directly to China too. So we continue to see that. So we're, as I mentioned, these are fingers crossed that continuation of the Phase 1 agreement is implemented through a new administration and that the relationship continues to hopefully have a stable foundation underneath it that includes moving away from tariff barriers and tariffs that continue to disrupt the market.
Can you speak a little bit more to the way that different agricultural industries in Nebraska work with each other to keep the state and the United States running, since Nebraska is considered as the food producers of the United States. So, for example, like your relationship with the beef industry and etc.
Absolutely. Several years ago, when we were going through strategic planning, our board made the statement that we would rather export a bushel of corn in a value-added form than in its raw form. And so what that meant to us and what that statement meant to our allied partners was that we would much rather build out the livestock industry, the ethanol industry, the value-added processing industry, because it creates economic development, it creates greater value to the marketplace, and it creates jobs for the state of Nebraska. As part of that, we also continue to develop a great working relationship with those industries. Myself and many of the partners that you have had speak before you have great relationships, not only at the staff level, but also at the board level, where routinely we are seeing each other at meetings and having conversations about how we continue to develop markets in partnership. We realize, as I mentioned in my opening comments, this huge agricultural complex is not just one entity, but it's a combination of feedstocks such as corn and soybean, our value-added livestock industry and red meat production, our ethanol industry, and our processing industry. So it's this huge complex, and all of us working together can accomplish a lot more than what we can individually. And that's where our board really appreciates the partnerships and the discussions that we have on a routine basis, both at the staff and board level.
And what are some disconnects that you have seen as a leader in the corn industry between the average corn producer in Nebraska and the rest of the United States in regards to American foreign policy?
Yeah, great question. There is sometimes a tendency to from a corn producer to really understand very well the local marketplace and what that marketplace means. And what our job is to make sure that we're connecting the dots from once they sell that bushel of corn for the first time locally, where does it end up internationally? And I would even say, where does it end up domestically and internationally? So how are we working through entities such as the National Corn Growers Association, international entities such as the U.S. Grains Council, U.S. Meat Export Federation, to better connect the dots on how that bushel of corn is ended up in a raw product in Japan or Mexico, or how it's ended up in a value-added product such as red meat in those similar countries or around the world. So what we've done is take a number of different promotional mediums, I guess I would say, so print, social media, video, directly themselves, and try to make them better or try to communicate with them the opportunities of the international marketplace, what role we're playing in that, but also what role they're playing in that if they didn't know it or understand it already. So some of it's seeing for themselves and taking producers into international markets and visiting with some of our major buyers internationally and developing those relationships. Some of it's, as I mentioned earlier, reverse trade missions, where we're bringing them back to their farms so they can showcase their operations and develop those relationships directly. And so we try to make that connection where there might be a disconnect so they better understand the value of international trade.
Great. So I have two more questions for you before we wrap up today's programming. And my first question is regarding the future of Nebraska and the farming industry. Where do you see the corn industry specifically going in the next 5 to 10 years? Or how would you like that how would you like that outcome to look?
Yeah. So I go back to the statement that our board made several years ago when we went through strategic planning in regards to we would rather export a value-added product than a raw commodity or raw product. So we advocate strongly here in Nebraska to recruit or expand our current value-added industries. Obviously, our red meat or our livestock industries are a key part of that. How do we continue to see that expansion? Nebraska was chosen about 2 years ago to locate a large poultry operation, and some of you may know them as Costco facilities or I guess retailers that you might see. And so that created a unique opportunity, but I think it also opened the door for others to understand that Nebraska is in a great position to continue to locate some of these expanded opportunities. Kristen and maybe others mentioned it about our kind of ruralness that we have across the state of Nebraska. And so we have some great locations where we can isolate or because of biosecurity, isolate various production capabilities. So we continue to look at expanding our livestock industry. Similarly, with our ethanol industry, we look at the opportunities of not only producing ethanol out of a facility, but how do we look at them as a biorefinery? There are a number of products and opportunities that can be produced with ethanol as a feedstock, such as bioplastics and renewable chemicals, and really base products for any number of consumable products that we would like to see expanded upon. And so we continue to promote that too. And so, domestically, we would sure like to see more value-added opportunities right here in the state. And obviously, then our role is to continue to work with partners at the domestic, so more at the national level and internationally, because we're talking about foreign policy, international trade, looking for those opportunities for those products in an international marketplace. We think there's a strong desire of it because of the growing population, the more awareness of our environment and communities and what that means for the products that we can provide. And so we want to continue to play in that marketplace over the next 5 to 10 years. So again, what it comes down to is local economic development and with a strong connection to international trade.
And then my final question for you before we wrap up today's session is, As future foreign policy practitioners here at SAIS, I'm wondering if you had any comments for students who are trying to think about American foreign policy and how to best keep Americans at the forefront of American foreign policy, specifically Nebraskans, since we tend to have an overview of America as only the East Coast or the West Coast.
Yep. So I would say you all probably bring a passion to the table. And you know, I would use that passion as the lens in what it provides for international trade. If that passion is something that connects you to a manufacturing industry or a manufacturing opportunity, use that as the kind of stepping stone or building block to understand how that relates to the international marketplace. The U.S. and specifically as we look at Nebraska are leaders in a number of different domestic production capabilities. And so how do we continue to build upon that and following your passions? The other thing that I would say is find mentors. Mentors may be fellow faculty or faculty members and professors there. That may be somebody within a policy focus in Washington, D.C. or others. Or it may be somebody within the manufacturing industry that has a focus within their job on international trade. Find a mentor to be able to sit down and visit with, because they will really be able to start connecting the dots and continue to pull that passion out of international trade. We've been lucky here in Nebraska to have some great mentors on international trade. I'm part of a Clayton Yiter Institute on International Trade and Finance. Clayton Yiter was the U.S. trade representative for the U.S. He was a USDA secretary too, but he was a Nebraskan. And so he's a great mentor for a number of people, including somebody like Darcy Vetter. Darcy Vetter was an ag trade ambassador during the previous Obama administration. And she originates from Nebraska, from a small farm and a small operation. And so she really brought a passion to that. So it's finding those mentors out there to continue to visit with and really pull some of that information out and connect the dots. I do want to address, and I thought you might bring it up, but I do want to say you had asked a question previously of Kristen in regard to logistics, especially transportation logistics. Nebraska is very well positioned, as Kristen mentioned, in regards to our internet or our interstate commerce system, but we have both or two leading Class 1 railroads that transverse across the state, and that provides us an opportunity where we can go east or west or south. We don't go north too often in regards to railroad, but as we look at west, we go out to the Pacific Northwest and the Washington, Oregon area for exports. We can go out to California as it provides an opportunity for exports there. We can go south down into Mexico, obviously, as we talked about being a key partner for us, but we can also go down to the Gulf. And more recently, we're starting to see the opportunity for going east into the Missouri and Mississippi River areas and it being transloaded onto barges, so the water and transversing down the Mississippi River to the Gulf. And so I think we're very well positioned to really feed either coast and go north or south. So wanted to add that in there. So, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's been great.
Yes, thank you so much for your time, Mr. Brunkhorst, and special thanks to all of the panelists who have joined us today. We will continue with our conversation tomorrow with public sector officials, and that session will be hosted by my co-host, John Bolton, who would like to promote tomorrow's activities.
Thanks to all the participants today. Tomorrow we'll start at the same time, 9 o'clock Central, 10 Eastern, and it'll be focused on the public sector, starting with the Assistant Nebraska Secretary of State, and then running down the gamut of various officials from the state and from U.S. Strategic Command. Thanks again for everyone that joined today, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you.